In the evening hours of August 7th, 2018, a 71-year-old man named Thomas Perez Sr. would go out for a late walk. It was a warm 74 degrees, and he had brought along Margosha, the family dog, to keep him company. With his phone and wallet left inside, the pair set off around the neighborhood. 7 minutes later, Margosha would return home, greeting Thomas Perez Jr. at the door. Tom Jr. noted his father's absence and headed over toward the mailbox, hoping to find him nearby. Unfortunately for him, his father was nowhere to be found. And even worse, his nightmare had only just begun. After 24 hours had passed, Perez Jr. had reported his father missing and contacted the local Fontana Police Department. After gathering information about the supposed disappearance, officers decided to take Perez Jr. in. Police interrogations are an important part of any case. It's here that law enforcement make their best effort at figuring out who the culprit of any case is. Most interrogations aren't seen by the public, and an overwhelming majority of interrogations last fewer than 2 hours. Thomas Perez Jr. wouldn't be so lucky, and his 17 hours of hell would start now. Both Thomas Perez Sr. and Jr. had gotten into an argument approximately 30 minutes before Thomas Perez Sr.'s disappearance. As a way to cool off, Perez Sr. grabbed Margot's leash and prepared to go around the block. Shortly after leaving, he would decide that he had different plans for his night. He let go of Margot's leash and sent her home. Perez Sr. had decided to take a trip to his girlfriend's house in El Monte, California, some odd 40 minutes away from his own residence. With no wallet, phone, or any kind of identification, he would presumably board a bus and begin his journey. For the first few hours of questioning, nothing would appear any different. Perez Jr. was asked simple questions about himself, his father, their relationship, and events leading up to his disappearance. At some point during this initial questioning, the three detectives and Perez himself would take a trip around the city of Fontana in an attempt to locate Tom's father. After this initial search would prove to be unsuccessful, the four men would return back to the interrogation room, where things would get more intense. At this point in the night, Perez had been up for far longer than he planned. It was around this time that he needed to take his medication. The police refused this request. He didn't get his medication, and instead Margot was brought in and placed on the ground beside him. At this point in the investigation, the detectives decided that it would be a good idea to lie about Perez Sr.'s whereabouts. Instead of saying that he hasn't been found, they informed Perez Jr. that his body was found, and in an effort to get a confession, the officers would repeatedly berate Perez Jr. He was told that Margot would have to be euthanized because she was so traumatized from witnessing the murder.
Yes, not only that, but poor Morgan here.
Margot
had to witness it.
Yep. I walked through the blood.
Yeah.
No.
Yeah.
Yes.
No.
Yeah.
Yes.
That night, in the interrogation room, Thomas Perez Jr. would try to commit suicide. At this point, all hope was lost. It was now August 8th. Thomas Perez Sr. had wrapped up his night at his girlfriend's house and, in another change of plans, wanted to visit his daughter, who lived in Northern California. Perez Sr. said his goodbyes and began heading towards San Gabriel Valley Airport. 14 hours into the investigation, nobody knew where Thomas Perez Sr. was, and nobody else had any idea of what his son was going through in that interrogation room. Thomas Perez Jr. was beginning to break. Actually, he had broken hours ago. The 17 hours of interrogation, combined with his sleep, food, and medication deprivation, had proven too much for him to handle. With the cast of officers interrogating him changing throughout the night, They had been able to convince Perez Jr. that not only was his father missing, but he had been murdered in cold blood, and he was the one to do it. He'd confessed to a crime he didn't commit. Not only that, but he confessed to a crime that didn't happen. Following the reading of his Miranda rights, one of the detectives received a phone call from Perez Jr.'s sister. She informed the detective of her father's location and explained that he was alive and well. Despite receiving this call, Perez Jr. was not released. Instead, he was placed under an involuntary 3-day psychiatric hold and was shipped off to a psych ward. It wasn't until 6 years later, in May of 2024, that Thomas Perez Jr. would finally receive some sort of compensation. Fontana, California had finally settled the case and agreed to pay him $898,000, despite never acknowledging any wrongdoing.